this is a cozy group of people, so we can all afford to relax a little bit and be very honest with one another in the moments to come. I just want to formally extend a very warm welcome on behalf of Muslims for Progressive Values and our colleagues in the room who very kindly put together this event. And I want to remind you that the title is the Peace Forum event on Imams for She, engaging religious men and women leaders in empowering women. We have a fantastic lineup, actually, of speakers, which you wouldn't guess because they're there. As in, they're not physically with us, but they are very much with us in spirit, mind, and body, I guess, long distance. And I will introduce them in a second. I think one of the things that it behooves us to reflect on for just a minute, and before I launch into that, I'll ask you, if you would not mind, to share in just a moment of reflective silence before we formally launch into the different presentations. Just 1 minute to meditate, reflect together. Thank you. Okay, Imams for She, engaging religious men and women leaders and empowering women. Again, warm welcome. On our panel today, we will have the following wonderful colleagues. Annie Sonnefeld is the founder and president of Muslims for Progressive Values. And I think the name of the organization says plenty already. Needless to say, they're one of the, I think, some of the bravest colleagues who have come together to tackle some of the most difficult, sensitive issues within their own religious community and worldwide. And we'll be looking forward to hearing from her shortly. But we have a really interesting lineup today because we're going to be seeing an amazing documentary, which Ani will share with you, which was prepared by our colleague here, who we're very happy to have with us, Rosa Rogers. And Rosa is the filmmaker and director of this movie called Casablanca Calling. Has anybody seen this movie? Anyone here seen Casablanca Calling? Oh, goody, it's a screening. Good. So we'll have an opportunity to see this movie together, and Rosa will kindly walk us through the movie background and some of the issues that are raised there. And we will also hear from another very dear friend of ours, Dr. Hind Jalal, who is the program specialist and advisor on gender issues in UNFPA's office in Morocco. And in case any of you don't know, UNFPA is the United Nations Population Fund, which does everything to do with reproductive health, all the way up the spectrum to anything else to do with populations, where people live, how they live, how many of them there are, what kinds of health issues do they confront, and what kinds of living conditions do they confront. It's a very small UN agency. We will be able to hear from all of them, but I just wanted to share a few thoughts to help frame some of the conversation that I hope we'll be able to have together, because one thing will be what we will hear. Another thing that we very much depend on will be what you will engage with us on from your varied backgrounds. 10 years ago, we started something in the UN system called the Interagency Task Force on engaging faith-based organizations for, at that time, it was the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. And some of the key questions that were asked from within the UN system at that time were, why do we need to have a task force within the UN that talks, or that is supposed to have as its feature this issue of engaging with faith-based and with religion? And why? That's not the business of the UN. The UN doesn't do religion. Literally, the UN doesn't do religion. And anyway, why do we need religions and values that are religious when we have the human rights? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is all the values anybody needs anywhere in the world, so thank you, we are valueful. The experience at that time was, why on earth do you need to have religion at the UN and with the UN? And it took a mighty long time, I think about a decade, working primarily with faith-based partners like yourselves, many of you in your organizations in the room, to bring to light some very clear, simple, remarkably phenomenal facts, which reminds me of Einstein's quote that the genius is in recognizing the obvious. So here were some of the obvious things that were apparently not recognized. Number one, 8 out of 10 people will list themselves as religious or affiliated or belonging to some religion or value system anywhere in the world. Number two, it turns out that out of all the social services that are provided globally, a good minimum of 30% of those social services, minimum of 30% of those social services are provided through, by, or managed by our religious institutions. And nowhere is this more clear than in the health and education sectors, where we realize that, frankly, most of the hospitals here in the United States of America, 70% of hospitals are run through, or by, or in some affiliation with the Catholic Church. So if that's the case in so-called developed economies, you can well imagine what it's like in the poorer countries in the world, where, frankly, the only sometimes social service provider will be either the church or the mosque or the temple. So the truth is that if we talk about sustainable development, which is all about social services, by the way, fundamentally it's about health, food, water, etc., then we're actually we are the new guys on the block. The international development world, the secular world, are actually the new guys on the block. The oldest guys on the block are, and have been since time immemorial, the churches, the mosques, and the synagogues. So much for service provision. Then we realized something else that was fascinating, which is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself was predicated upon the values shared by all religions. And it was inspired by, and it is all about, the values that are predicated upon all the different faith traditions. So it's not as if we're reinventing the wheel, and it's not a religion on its own, in its own separate domain. It is actually predicated upon all the religions of the world and the shared and common values. That's part of its strength, by the way. And the last thing that we also realized was that in so many parts of the world, religion, in spite of the so-called secular dynamics, the secular societies exist in one part of the world only, really. And it's actually a very small part of the world when you look at a map, and that's Europe. And Western Europe, for that matter. It isn't even all of Europe. Because Southern Europe, heaven knows, is still pretty committed to its own religiosity. So we realized that we're all operating with a very secular notion of development that was and is and continues to be inspired by the experiences of a few nations, very few nations in the world. In other words, we are still in a post-colonial context whereby our own framing and understanding of life is still framed by a few countries based in a small part of the world. Because secular life, in the sense where religion gets to be separated so distinctly from every other domain, especially the public domain, that reality is nowhere in the world except in a handful of Western European countries. And yet we assume it, and we work with that understanding of what it means to be developed and what human development is from within that framework. We're still trying to pass that knowledge on internally within the UN system. One of the things we have learned as well, once we saw the light, religion matters, we also realized something else, which is very easy to realize every night when you listen to the news, which is that religion isn't always the source of everything good. That sometimes it can be the very same, or it can be allegedly the very same source of much of what causes conflict, harm, strife, and frankly a pain in many people's lives. And when it comes to the issues of women's rights, nowhere is this more the case, where we find ourselves as men and women who are concerned about women's rights and about gender empowerment. We find ourselves often at loggerheads with certain religious institutions, certain religious leaders, by no means with all religion, but with certain representatives of religious institutions who make it difficult for us to claim the very equality that our spirits effectively have according to text. And I think this is precisely why we have to consider what we've done for the last, 75 years, 100 years, since we know of Western feminism and feminism as we know in the rest of the world, where we operated under the assumption that to be a feminist, you had to put religion aside. And somehow the notion that you could be a feminist within your own faith tradition, that indeed your faith could inspire the very values of equality and dignity, that is something that we're now having to come to terms with and allow into the public sphere. It was always in our lives, in the lives of many of us around the world. But it is today that truth, that faith can be the root of your feminist impulses and aspirations, That truth we are allowing to seep gradually into the public space. And this is one of the reasons why the engagement with religion is not a matter of a luxury. It's not a matter of, gee, let's look at it every now and then. But actually, it is very much a matter of necessity for many of us who drink from the fountain of faith and believe in the ultimate aspiration that we are equal to one another as human beings. And here is why the entire principle of Imams for She, which is built and predicated on a campaign that our colleagues in UN Women co-launched with civil society, on He for She, the notion that, you really kind of, another crystal, amazing piece of news that we discovered. We can't do women's empowerment as women only. We kind of need the other half to do the women's empowerment thing. So now that we've discovered men, one of the functions that men have, some men, in fact most men and only, is religious leadership. We are still struggling to get the few women who are in positions of religious leadership to be acknowledged as religious leaders in their own right. When we have that clarity that the domain of leadership in religious communities is still largely controlled by men, and in spite of certain religious traditions, it is still very much largely controlled and represented by men. And we also know that we have to work with some of these men. The idea of He for She in the domain of religion becomes particularly important and relevant and necessary. Now, the beauty of something like Imams for She, which is very unique to this particular campaign that Muslims for Progressive Values is carrying forward, is that they've taken that notion that He for She is important, and then said, oh, and guess what? It's those religious He's in the Muslim world, i.e. the Imams, whom we need to have on board. And we won't be able to achieve half of what we want to achieve, which is not only gender equality, but it is that quintessential sense of dignity that every human being should have, regardless of anything else, but that we won't be able to come anywhere near that particular objective without involving the Imams. Now, we get a lot of pushback in terms of, do you really need those religious leaders, and aren't they the ones who are causing the problem in the first place? Yes, they are, many. But that's also why we have to work with them. That's also why it's important not to tarnish all the Imams who are out there with the same brush. They're not all ISIS. We need to work with that community in order for us to be heard and legitimate, and in order for us, frankly, to be empowered to make the case that our human dignity is also very much part of how the leadership of these religious institutions is ready or not to engage. Many of you have seen and heard what has come out of the Synod, the Catholic Synod. You've heard about the tensions. Why does it matter so much what the men in the church have to say? It matters. We can debate whether it should or not. The fact is, it matters. And it matters in every single other religious tradition as well. And one of the things that Muslims for Progressive Values has decided to do is take the bull by the horns and say, there are very progressive Imams out there. And if we don't give the platform to engage with these progressive Imams, then who will? And that's precisely what I hope we will hear more about in the presentations to come. Now, my orders are that after I be quiet, we are to show a movie, the documentary, Casablanca Calling, and the screening herein begins. Over to the screening. Thank you.